So our next speaker is Sarah Slye. She will be presenting a presentation titled Connections Between the North and South Caucasus. Sarah holds a Ph.D. in history from the University of Cambridge and MA in Near Eastern Studies from the University of Arizona, an MA in Russian and East European Studies from UNC Chapel Hill, and a BA in Russian Studies from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Sarah serves as Director of Coordination for ANCS. Her work explores historical and contemporary connections across the Caucasus region, and today she will review some representations of the North Caucasus and Caucasus in ancient and medieval sources, reminding us that despite modern political divisions, the Caucasus has long been an interconnected space. So Sarah.
Okay, so like I said, I wanted it to be 5 minutes, but I'm afraid I probably can't do that, but I'll still hopefully keep it quite short. Whenever the concept of the Caucasus as a region comes up, someone invariably raises the question of whether or not we're perhaps, is it really a region? Are we imposing some Western framework, perhaps the residue of the Imperial Russian administrative vision over this rich this area with a lot of rich demographical differences, unique nations and peoples, and so on. As we launch our new association for the advancement of North Caucasus studies, with the express hope that our members will actively engage with the South Caucasus in our and their research and emphasize the connections between the North and the South Caucasus. And at the same time as in Europe, I just got back from Europe, the field of Caucasus studies is growing, and there's a lot of exciting movement taking place there, consolidation and so on. So the question we have to face this question, what is Caucasus studies? What are North Caucasus studies? What are South Caucasus studies? Can we even look at these places as a region? And we need to reflect a little bit as to whether it really is self-evident. I mean, to me, it's self-evident. To many of you, it might be self-evident. But is it self-evident, really, that the North Caucasus, South Caucasus, or even Caucasus as a whole can be defined as a region? So first of all, I would invite curiosity and an open mind to this question. It does not have to be answered definitively, as this is a question that has been around for a very long time, long before the Russian Empire or Western area studies categories or sensitivities about, getting it right. In fact, if we look at the ancient and medieval sources, we will find pretty much the same three ways of categorizing the nations and peoples of the Caucasus as we find today. There's kind of three main patterns that you'll discover if you look through them. The first one is separate nations with very little to bind them together. There's not much of a region shown.
For some reason, I'm going to share it from my.
Okay, well, I'll just look over here, I guess. Oh, you'll share it. Okay. Oh, I kind of wanted to look. Okay.
Was it slide 2?
If you want to put it here, I'll just do it myself. Right, so there's separate nations, kind of little by way of regional coherence. You might find some kind of describing it, putting them all together as individual nations in some kind of coherent region. And you might find sort of a mix of the above with quite clear north-south distinction. Actually, I came up with those categories a while ago. And so I was revisiting them this time for this event. And I'm starting to see them a little more deeply and look a little more deeply into them, starting to see some of the nuances. So I'm revisiting these categories. I'm not claiming this as the final word, but I thought I might share with you some of the characteristics of how these authors relate to the question of valid ways of viewing the Caucasus analytically, or parts of the Caucasus. Separate, I had over there. Okay, so Pliny seems to look at them quite separately. He looks at every different little tribe and nation quite separately. They're sort of jumbled in there with all these other peoples of Asia. However, there is an interesting part where, he does talk about how many of these different groups came together in Dioscorius and things like that. So you see some sort of economic interconnections nevertheless. Ptolemy, he also just lists the different countries separately, but if you look past the words, he does actually sort of put Asian Sarmatia on one map, or he says it should be on one map. And he writes that Colchis and Iberia and Albania of the South, what we would call today the South Caucasus, should be on their own little map. So he does kind of have a sort of north-south distinction, in fact, and group the South Caucasus together to a degree. Just some of the pictures. So we also have a Persian inscription called the Cube of Zoroaster, and he just kind of lists the countries as far as the Caucasus Mountains. So here's another example of an outside observer seeing these countries as separate places. He just lists them along with various other countries around. Finally, if I can say it correctly, we have the Nushat al-Qulub. And this is a Persian source or a Persian author, if I'm correct. And in his book, you kind of just see these places, different places in the Caucasus, all listed rather separately. So I certainly saw this more as individual nations. However, there's two little stories in there where you start to see him nevertheless kind of showing a coherent region. If you look at the part about description of the mountain El Elbrus, so he means Mount Elbrus. So the Mount Kaf is the one up at the edge of the world and so on, but this Mount Elbrus is really the one we're talking about, the Caucasus and the Caucasus mountain chain system. And he describes kind of these people interconnected in that system, all moving further down into the Middle East even. And there's another little story about an expedition that went off to like search for the wall of Gog and Magog. And so they're going up through the South Caucasus up into the North Caucasus to different kingdoms before going further on. So you also see kind of how there's this interconnection there. Okay, so there's the evidence to prove what I said. And some of my favorite ones you'll find, they present the Caucasus as a region because it's a whole chapter that the Caucasus, they call it this, everything is put in the same chapter. And you can see they're conceptualizing it as a region. To go fast, I'll just say that my favorite one maybe is Strabo, but you also find this in Al-Masudi. So this is right here in Strabo. It's very hard to miss. Book 11, chapter 2. You can find it in Al-Masudi if you want to read chapter 17. And with Idrisi, originally, I thought of Idrisi looking at them all sort of separately, but when I read it again, I started thinking he's actually kind of putting them in the same section as well, regardless. So you can look in volume 2, the 5th climate and the 6th section, and compare that with the 6th climate, 6th section elsewhere. And finally, you have those with still kind of working on these, but they're sort of varied, but you have a little, when I read them the first time, I noticed more clear distinction between north and south. And that would be Herodotus, which is quite interesting because you see him describing the people of the mountain near, what did he say? Near the Caspian, but separate, in a separate place. He's talking about Colchis and certain tribes that are probably, Proto-Georgian tribes, Kartvelian tribes of some kind, and kind of connecting them together. And you can find this in some of the other authors, but still kind of working on that. But I think I noticed this in Ibn Hakau, in his book of Roads and Kingdoms. He's kind of describing the peoples and cities of the southern part and the northern part separately in different sort of sections. But you also find them connected over at Derbent. So again, you're still finding these connections even when they're describing people separately. So there's plenty more to discover. I really want to dig deeper and deeper into these sources. I think they're fascinating. And but I hope this review of these older sources would encourage everyone to help us feel free to look at the Caucasus, including the South Caucasus and the North Caucasus, and the individual nations with some more flexibility and inclusivity, and allowing ourselves to look at it several ways at once simultaneously. I don't think we have to define it one way or the other, and the other ways are all wrong. We can have layers and see that all simultaneously. At the same time, I hope that this review should encourage us to be confident in the use of the word Caucasus studies or North Caucasus studies or South Caucasus studies. Thank you. And thank you very much to everyone who joined the board and came to see us and who will be senior advisors, and most especially to Lydia, Diego, and Alika for their hard work. Thank you.